I have to say, never before have I felt that this is such a poignant statement. Women are not little men when we think about research, particularly as it relates to a lot of the clinical issues that affect women much more than men.
And for you, having been, an obstetrician and gynecologist in your career, that's obviously very clear. That's where your focus is. But what's so exciting about our guest today, Carolee Lee from WHAM, who's been a success at every other thing that she's done before she turned her focus on women's health, is she really characterizes what's going on as a communication problem. And she's approached it as a business person, not as a research scientist. And like everybody else, and I see this in all the fundraising meetings I'm in, people respond to a snippet, to a data point. And with the report that she put out several years ago and the ones that we keep hearing about, people now have a number where they can say, this is the impact.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that I think we've had in women starting women's health companies is the stories are personal, and that's important and that's motivating. But sometimes that takes the investor's eye off the ball of how am I going to get a return on this? What are the outcomes, not just health-wise, but financially that I'm going to get? So I think, she brings a really sort of cross-functional, exciting approach.
Well, she's an amazing communicator. And I'd like to add that with her work will come better patient outcomes and lower mortality and morbidity rates. So let's talk to Carolee.
Welcome to the Business of the V. Hello, friends and colleagues. I'm Dr. Alyssa Dweck.
And I'm Rachel Braun Scherl. Each week, we bring you the most fascinating investors, inventors, entrepreneurs, academics, and healthcare practitioners who are making things happen in women's sexual and reproductive health.
If you are a woman, know a woman, have a business, or care about your V health and wellness, fasten your seatbelts and listen in to another informative and inspiring episode.
We are so excited to have our guest today, Carolee Lee, who has many, many titles, but her current focus is on Women's Health Access Matters, which is a movement that she has created at an organization to really change dramatically the conversation, the resources, the outcomes of what's happening in women's health. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel and Alyssa. Wonderful to be with you.
So you had, like many of our guests, didn't start in women's health. You had a couple other successful service businesses. How did you parlay that into this? Can you just share a little bit about the journey?
With pleasure. So in some sense, I did start in women's health in that my company that I built and eventually had the pleasure of selling was 85% women. And what I realized in building that company is that when women were not at work, it affected my bottom line. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of stuck with me and registered later, which I'll get to. And then the other part of building the company that really affected me was I was invited to be on different boards. And one of the boards that I served on was the Breast Cancer Research Foundation from the day it was started for about 20 years. So I understand pretty well how research is done, how marketing and very savvy distribution techniques can affect outcomes of women's health, which normally we don't think about, and how family foundations, which although the Breast Cancer Research Foundation was certainly run and is a foundation, all good foundations like that have leadership, and the Lauder family were extraordinary leaders. So my teeth were kind of cut, if you will, on understanding those different elements first. And then in terms of building this business, what I realized was that I needed to keep that workforce healthy.
Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense, since we always tell our patients that if they don't take care of themselves, they won't be able to take care of anybody else, whether that's in the workplace or in the family. So makes sense.
It's so interesting that, you saw the connection. Obviously, when people aren't at work, it's not good for your bottom line, but it's even more impactful in a negative way. It sounds like if your workforce is primarily female and not healthy, not a negative for the workforce to be female. So talk about what WHAM is, why you created it, and what the objective. And I know it's a long-term play, but if you just look at what you've accomplished, even in the last 6 months, it's growing at an exponential fashion.
It is. And, it's only 3.5, 4 years old, because it took us 1.5 years, 2 years to do the study with Rand, which I'll talk about in a minute. Let me segue from selling that business to WHAM. So like I said, even though my career was in the world of fashion, doesn't matter. I built a global brand, understand branding, understand marketing. That's very important, because a lot of what WHAM is doing actually is marketing and figuring out a different way to communicate. A lot of the issues I think we have right now that are centered around women's health are issues around the lack of being able to communicate effectively. Not only the data, but the emotional stories that need to go with the data that would create a shift or a change. So the question becomes, how are we going to create change within women's health? So let me segue from selling my business, which was just a wonderful moment in my life, and realizing now that I could do anything I wanted to do. And don't ask exactly why, but somehow I decided to start hosting wellness conferences for women, because I think also most of my friends were getting kind of to an age where everyone was getting either burnt out or having issues. And so I started inviting extraordinary thought leaders in the world of wellness and well-being, and especially in women's health, to different locations that I was hosting these amazing conferences. So places like Aspen and Miami in the winter, and just places that you'd want to go, and people that you'd want to be with, and certainly experts that you'd want to hear from. And I started, not that I didn't know all this data, but I understood, this is now 4 years ago, I understood all the data that I had accumulated over my career that showed the great disparities and discrepancies that existed in women's health, and the fact that there was so little data. And I realized also that even though most of my circle was very well educated, highly successful, none of us knew this data. So what's the data? 2/3 of the population that has Alzheimer's are women. Women are twice as likely to have Alzheimer's as men. Lung cancer kills more white smoking, 2 times the rate, white smoking. White non-smoking women as white non-smoking men, more than ovarian, cervical, and breast cancer combined. And I could sit here all afternoon and give you data. So, but none of my friends knew this data. And when I would start telling them, they'd look at me and say, like, you're crazy. And so I decided, before I really took this seriously, to reach out. And I think it's kind of a funny part of the story, to Carolyn, Missouri, because I live in Connecticut. Carolyn was up at Yale, and Carolyn now, of course, is running the White House research initiative. And I said, we don't know each other, but I want to validate some data. I wonder if I could drive up. And that started a relationship for about 3 or 4 months, where we would go back and forth about, is this really true? Is this really accurate? And then I would do the same thing with Hadeen Jaffe up at Brigham Harvard. And eventually Brigham Harvard became our lead scientific partner. So let's start with that. To me, the most important thing is to have accurate, compelling data. The next thing is, how do you transmit, how do you communicate that data in a meaningful way? And what I realized was that all the researchers that we were talking to that were focused, excuse me, on women's health, for the most part, are 98% women. And if you talk to them and listen to them, they've been all saying the same thing for probably the past 20 or 30 years, since the Revitalization Act 30 years ago was enacted, that said that women should be part of research and clinical trials. So some things have changed, but a lot of things have not changed. And the fact is that this data 3 or 4 years ago, when I started sharing it in a more meaningful way, most people now know more of this data, because it's out.
The conversation has changed so dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years in a positive direction.
Well, which I think WHAM had something to do with, because
Absolutely,
we started talking about this and started shooting out infographics and other means of communication that were not focused on, and this is the key, inequity, inequality, and social justice. These are all issues of all three, but instead we engaged the Rand Corporation as a group of business people to say, is there an economic argument to be made by accelerating women's health research? That was the question.
I really want to jump in here, because what is literally ringing in my brain right now is the WHI and the misinformation and data that came out of that study that wasn't recognized for 20 years. So as you are collecting data now, how do we avoid that type of kind of catastrophic situation, if you will, which really, caused so many women to suffer and really scared a lot of healthcare practitioners away from the standard treatment for menopause?
I think, Alyssa, that it's somewhat different because I think the data that we're getting is basically, we got most of our data either from NIH or other sources, not from individuals. And so we were more focused on the numbers. So the amount of investment, in other words, the amount of investment being made by NIH in the 4 areas that we studied, which were brain health, cardiovascular, cancer, and autoimmune, was 350 million, which is a very small number.
Mm-hmm.
If you double that number, you get a return of 14 billion to the economy. We were not focused, as the WHO study was, more on what are the side effects of, or the effects of hormone replacement therapy on heart, et cetera. We didn't go there. We went more, right. What's the economic argument? Can I make an economic argument? Is there anything that I can say that's going to convince anyone that, this is not just equity and equality. This is really not, look what the return is. Let's change the fabric of society.
Yeah, I guess where I was thinking is that the economic burden to society from the misinformation put out by the WHI, and I'm not placing any blame. I'm just simply stating a fact that it was reinterpreted after time. Imagine how much of an economic burden that was when all these women probably left the workplace because they were too uncomfortable to continue. Would you agree? Would you agree with that?
Totally, 100% accurate. Yeah. We didn't go there. That would be an interesting study on its own, but it's so in the past that I would prefer to look to the future to say,
sure,
what impact is menopause having on the workplace, and try to quantify that economic loss.
And so now, in addition to the work that you're doing, there are lots of other groups who are quantifying. The number we keep hearing about is the $1.8 billion impact of menopause in the workplace. We hear about the $1 trillion opportunity from the McKinsey study. It's really, for me, coming from a business perspective, so cool to see how much the conversation has changed, because you said something really interesting. It's not that health inequity or health access are not important, but clearly for some segment of society, it wasn't sufficiently motivating to get the money there to change the situation.
And, honestly, Rachel, I think it's still challenging to get the money. I will counsel young entrepreneurs, to speak differently when they go in for a meeting, because often, depending on who you're meeting with, what would you rather hear if you're a group of young bravado guys, not very familiar with women's health issues? Which argument would you like to hear? I have a new product and it's about the microbiome of the vagina, and I'd love to talk to you about it. Or let me talk to you about the ROI of a new product that I've created that I think is very unique because it affects 52% of the population.
Yeah. And having had that experience with many venture capitalists, we got to the point after we had a product that was, one of the early Viagras for women, which is a misnomer for anyone who actually understands female sexual response. But in any case, we were talking about the satisfaction and different numbers and percentage of women who didn't have satisfying sexual experiences. And we finally got to, she likes it more, she wants to have it more, let's talk about the business model. And you have to figure out a way in to the conversation, because societally, it's not just men, it's society, different cultures, different religions. We are not comfortable talking about body parts, certainly women's body parts.
However,
so, if you're preaching to the choir,
if you include HCPs in that conversation, they're not typically thinking about ROI or bottom line. They're thinking about the safety and efficacy for their patients. So I think there needs to be some bridging language, and it sounds like WHAM is hopefully encroaching on that. Here's today's hot flash. Women are often unequally affected by certain diseases. For example, 80% of autoimmune patients are women, 66% of Alzheimer's disease patients are women, and women are 50% more likely to die within the year following a heart attack than men. I wanted to go back to menopause in the workplace. If that's okay. Because there are so many stats out there, and many organizations that are trying to address this. Would you consider menopause to be a subject matter that should be studied on your platform for this reason?
Totally. I mean, I think any condition that affects a woman should be studied. You know, it's just a question of time and where the energy is best spent to get the greatest return. You know, we chose the 4 areas that we chose because they're most likely to affect women disproportionately, exclusively, predominantly, or differentially. And that was our original lens by which we were looking through. And also, we were very focused on creating ethical, empirical, and economical data. That's not easy to do. So if you start, you know, throwing out these different lenses and saying, this is how we want to, you know, be thinking about these different disease conditions or conditions. And these are the results that we really would like to try to have. Well, that's not easy. And it took us a number of years. So, you know, it took us a number of years and obviously the commitment of a interesting group of business women to make this happen. And we now have significant partners, KPMG, Northwell Health, American Heart Association, et cetera, who obviously are very interested in the work that we're doing because it benefits everyone, including them. But, you know, the idea is, for me, like both of you, is it's a little bit out of the box. It's a little bit rebellious. It's a little, you know, it's not one size fits all. And, you know, how do we make enough noise to really make a shift? Because let's get back to the communication. This is a communications problem. The 3 of us have identified that wherever it is about how do you communicate effectively to the person who's sitting in front of you in order to get them to think a little bit differently than the way they might be thinking.
So one of the conversations I have often when I'm speaking to groups is, you know, colloquial titled "In a Hot Flash, Women's Health and Overnight Sensation Centuries in the Making." And what I like to describe, and I'd really love to hear your perspective on this, is what's happening now with the White House initiative and the ARPA-H funding and all these other things were a result of decades of work by people like Alyssa working and treating patients and others in the scientific community, decades of people trying to build businesses and starting this conversation. Do you look at the White House initiative as a result? I would think to me that you would sit in a position as WHAM and feel proud that one of the reasons this happened was because of efforts like the one that you've been putting forth for the past several years.
I think without the WHAM data, it would not have happened. I know that. We are in close touch and have been from 6 months before it was formed, where we were having calls with the Jen Klein and the Gender Policy Council and a host of people to offer data and information. Remember, it gets back to the data. And so I think the keeper of the data wins here, because this is not an anecdotal conversation that needs to take place. It's about, as Alyssa has spent her career and others, it's about accumulating vast amounts of data on patients and many others. And I am very grateful. I feel very much that I stand on the shoulders of many who came before me. And that's one of the reasons last June when we hosted in DC a wonderful conference, which WHAM tends to do. We invited Barbara Mikulski, Connie Morella, Vivian Pinn, and honored them for the great work that they've done, that they did 30 years ago, at least, to get this off and running. This is not, I haven't created anything new. All I'm doing is moving the ball forward in a way, remember, that either communicates differently, thinks differently. I'm a business person in a health uniform. You know, it's like, that doesn't necessarily go. And who wants to bring together many different parts of the ecosystem to create a change. So government is one piece, and we'll get to that in a minute. But you need you need academia, you need the financial communities, you need the business community. You need all these different pieces together, and that's what we tried to do at that June convening, is honor that group of extraordinary leaders. Nancy Pelosi stopped by, said a few words. You know, I was told she would say a few words and leave in 5 minutes. She stayed for an hour and a half. It was a wonderful moment of bringing together people who spent their lives, to your point, you know, contributing to this. I'm a newcomer, and if I can spend a little bit, that's great. So that afternoon, we then hosted a roundtable and developed the concept of 3, not 30. I'm not waiting another 30 years. What can we change in 3 years, not 30?
Put that in context for people who are not familiar with the Revitalization Act, so they understand how powerful that is.
So the Revitalization Act was 30 years ago was an act signed by President Clinton. It wasn't a mandate. It actually set guidelines for how women were supposed to be included in clinical trials and research. All the experts will say to you, some changes have taken place, not enough. So I can't sit here and tell you all the things that have or haven't, and it doesn't really matter. The question becomes, if certain things haven't changed, why not? And how do we make that happen? And that was the lens by which we were looking through it. So on that date in June 13th, we celebrated those who did make it happen. I mean, Barbara Mikulski pounding her hands on, her fists on the table saying, we're going to go to NIH, we're going to make change. I mean, talk about dynamos. It makes me look like I'm half asleep. And the idea that they were able to convince Congress that, in fact, this needed to be done. Fantastic. Fast forward 30 years later, I could sit here and tell you a lot of things that haven't changed, like heart disease in women. You know all the things that haven't changed. And 3 Not 30 was developed as a concept to say, how and what can we change in 3 years, not 30?
Yeah.
Because
Are you using your data for hospital platforms or for insurance platforms, any of those types of things? I'm sure they're very interested in ROI.
It's such a great question, Alyssa. And yes, the answer is we'd like to. We just haven't, we're so new that honestly, part of what we're trying to do is figure out how to use the data in the most effective way and with whom.
Yeah.
And we're, a small, lean, mean team, but, you've got, just like you, so many hours in the day.
Is your data collected worldwide, or is it limited to the States, since a lot of this sounds like it's government, government related?
The WHAM report that we created in those 4 disease classification, that data came from NIH. And so being the largest funder on the planet, we decided that it made more sense to start there. And then we are now looking at global data, but that takes, the problem is if there's so little data in the US, imagine what there is in sub-Saharan Africa.
Sure. And how do you measure this? So are you measuring outcomes in terms of people getting better, people being saved, mortality rate going down, or just by the number of, I guess, individuals that you compile in your data group?
Or the amount of money raised or the amount of money put into women's health research?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. And Rand did microsimulation models in a variety of different ways to get what we wound up with. But, what we wound up with wasn't what we fed out. And I'm going to come back to, it's a marketing communications exercise.
Yeah.
How do you take that data? Because no one wants to sit and read all that data, but they want to know, how does it affect me? How does it affect, women in general? Yeah. But, how does it affect families? And so we tried to take it and distill it into not only sound bites, but ways that it would affect a particular individual. And I think that's very critical when you're talking about any of these disease differentials.
Yeah, for sure. It seems to me that the ultimate measurement would really be whether the disease rate or mortality or morbidity rate from that disease is actually going down. That would be super interesting and
It would be.
and really great.
Yeah, no, it would be. It's not exactly where we started. Again, I think what we were trying to do is to look at what the discrepancies and the disproportionate amounts of monies were being allocated by it. Why are we not studying women? We're not 175-pound white males. Why are there so? And then in our 3 Not 30 goals, the first goal is double the budget. Well, that's that $350 million budget that I referred to. And the second part is double the VC money. It's like 2%. You kidding me?
Yeah.
Okay, that has to go to 4 at least.
Yeah. No. Look, women are not little men. I think this is a comment that just keeps coming up over and over in conversations. I'm wondering if you've seen super successes. So what comes to mind for me, and I don't know whether this is something that WHAM has ever been involved in, is the absolute benefit we've seen from, let's just say, the HPV treatment, and cervical cancer and other HPV related disease. If you had anything to do with data collection on this front, this seems like it really could be an amazing, measurable outcome in terms of patient lives and morbidity.
Yeah, we had such a great question. No, we haven't gone in that direction yet. But certainly one of the things that we're thinking about, just like we're thinking about global, I think, I was recently very humbled to be named one of the first launch of the 100 most influential people by Time Magazine in global health. Well, all of a sudden we're global because Time told me that I was. So
I like that.
right. So let's just focus on, imagine now I feel the responsibility to at least have much more global data than we do, which we were starting to do anyway. But like I tried to allude to, isn't much out there for undeveloped countries.
So I have a thought and a question. One of the things that for me has really helped all these conversations is that we're looking at women's health much more broadly, not just many more conditions, but we're looking at the totality of the impact. You talked about it early on. When women aren't at work, it affects your bottom line. When children aren't in school, it affects women being in work. It affects the bottom line. So one of the things that has come up is not just the cost of treatment, the cost of lost work days, the cost of lowering retention, the decline in productivity. So one of the things that I think this ecosystem of businesses has done is they said, you know what? No one was looking at these numbers. We're now going to tell you. It's not about how many days a menopausal woman spends in the hospital. It's how many days she misses work or isn't at her peak productivity. I don't know, maybe I know you are a visionary, but 3.5 years ago, to me, it was unfathomable that we would have made the exponential progress that we have. What is sort of like the North Star? If you could look 3 years ahead, 10 years ahead, what do you want to be able to say? This is what we did.
Wow. That's a terrific question. That falls into another question I have for you, Rachel. Someone walks into the room and says, Rachel, Alyssa, you can have as much money as you want. What would you like to do? So
I would fund female entrepreneurs who are focused on women's health.
and I agree with you, but it's kind of, and that, okay, so you do have a clear answer, but a lot of people just like, oh my God, that's overwhelming,
Yeah,
So
me. I feel that way. I don't know how I would answer that question.
Correct. Whereas Rachel immediately did. And I'm probably with her. I'd probably do the same thing. So, part of my personal gratification, I'll tell you one quick story. There's an institute out in La Jolla called La Jolla Institute for Immunology. There was a young woman who was a researcher there who I convinced to come. We were hosting one of our wonderful conferences up in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, at a wonderful resort there, right on the beach. She was on her way to a Fulbright in Scotland. I was visiting that institute out in La Jolla. A small group of us were. It wasn't the only thing we were doing, but we happened to be visiting it because we were interested in immunology, because autoimmune affects 80% women. This is in, you have to catch the date here. It's in like summer of 2018, I want to say.
Okay, yeah.
And in or maybe, anyway, let's just say it's 2018. And I convinced her
It's hard to figure out what date exactly.
but you're going to see why it's such a funny story, right? And so I said, Eric, we all fell in love with her. Erica, she studied things like Zika, Ebola, like arcane and very bizarre viruses, we thought, right? Okay, so she comes, we invite her, she comes, and we always start these meetings like on a Thursday night with dinner and drinking, and everyone is like just wanting to see each other. And then Friday is like all these different sessions. So I made her, I thought she was interesting. So it didn't surprise me. I made her the opening speaker Thursday night, and I'm kind of watching everyone. It's like, no one's really interested in these bizarre viruses. And then, of course, fast forward to COVID.
Yeah.
Everyone is very interested in these bizarre. She is a phenomenal speaker. Fast forward that we're in touch with her. A group of us are kind of mentoring her. It looks like they're going to change management and leadership at La Jolla Institute for Immunology, one of the leading institutes in immunology in the world. And she says to a group of us that she really wants to be the CEO. We're business people, and we say to her, you're freaking crazy. You understand what you're going to be doing. It's not research. You're going to be hiring and firing. You're going to be fundraising. And then we go through the whole thing. Nope, it's what she wants to do. Now, she's got, I don't know how many degrees. She goes and gets an MBA. And she's hell bent to do this. Let's just keep moving now to today. She got that job. And what has she done with LJI? She has transformed the research there, that every researcher must focus on male and female cells, male and female animal models,
Yeah.
looking for the differences in that research between men and women, male and female. Guess what? If I could do that in every institute around the country, you'd have a major shift.
Well, I think on that note, we will close. That's a great story, and it sounds like she was on a mission, and kudos to her. We want to thank you so much for joining us on the show. So many insights. I have a feeling we will be watching with awe as progress really takes off with research for women. Thank you.
I so appreciate your enthusiasm, your interest in all the great things you've done, Alyssa, and of course, Rachel.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast at businessofthev.com for the latest trends and trendsetters in women's health and business.